Okay, so welcome you guys to Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays. If you haven't joined us for Wednesday, we have Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays about every third Wednesday of the month here with University of Maryland Extension. My name's Agnes and I work for University of Maryland Extension. I'm part of the forestry group there and I coordinate the Maryland Delaware Master Logger Program and I do landowner education. So if you have property that has some forest or some trees and you want some advice or you want to talk about it or stewardship ideas that you just want to kind of suss out, you can give me a call, send me an email, and I'd love to talk to you. So Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays is a series that we started in 2020, and we're pleased to have every month this month filled. Except for December, we're not going to do one in December. You know, it falls in a holiday time. So I'm excited that this month we're going to be doing creating a bird-friendly yard. So birds are our closest neighbors. They share our spaces, getting on with business of life around us. Their songs are part of the soundtrack of our world, and watching them can bring us delight. During this program, we'll take a peek into the lives of backyard birds and learn about things we can do to invite them into our yards and help them thrive. So letting you all know that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available to you on our website, extension.umd.edu. And also what's going to happen is Taylor is our background roadie person, which I'll introduce in it. She is our background person here doing the technical stuff. And she will send out a resource list along with the recording so you can have it. Also, when you registered, you automatically get signed up for the free quarterly newsletter for notices for upcoming events. If you want to opt out, hey, do it if you want to. You can email P. Thomas there with a message saying no events. So today, we're hoping that you're going to have lots of questions and comments, and hopefully you're going to use that chat box there at the bottom of your screen, you know, that little bubble there, to ask your questions and put in your chats. We're always interested in what you have to say. And Sam and I, well, Sam, I'm not going to be doing the answering the questions, but Sam is going to do her best to answer all the questions at the end. So Samantha will do her presentation and then we'll do the questions at the end. So let me tell you a little bit about our presenter, Samantha Pitts. She has been a teacher, naturalist, and volunteer coordinator at Pickering Creek Audubon Center for over a decade. During this time, she has guided students and others in exploring and understanding the natural world. Her work includes engaging students in conservation stewardship as part of the center's environmental education programs offered through local school systems. She organizes volunteer restoration, conservation and community science efforts, and collaborating with partners on conservation outreach in the local community. Can I tell you one thing that I partner with Sam with? I helped her plant some trees in St. Michael's. They're doing some great work, not only at the Audubon Center, but in their greater community. So I'm very excited to have Sam present to us today. And as you know, Pickering Creek is in Talbot County. Right now, I'm in Talbot County too. Where are you guys from? We're going to put a poll question up here asking, where are you from? Are you from Eastern Maryland, Western Maryland, Central Maryland? So I'm from Eastern Maryland. Sam, what about you? Where are you coming from today?
So I'm coming right from Pickering Creek, so I'm in Eastern Maryland with you. Or I guess Central Eastern Maryland.
On location. She's coming to us from on location. So great. We have a good variety of people here. We appreciate you joining us. So thank you for that. So without further ado, why don't I pass the baton? I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pass the baton on to our guest speaker, Samantha Pitts, to tell us about birds in our backyard.
Thank you, Agnes. And good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. I am going to share my screen, so if you can just give me a second here. Okay. that going. I'm very excited to be with you today to talk about creating a bird-friendly yard. No matter what size yard you have, there are birds, and birds are some of our nearest neighbors. And it's such a pleasure and joy to have birds as neighbors, and would love to share with you ways that Pickering Creek, we try to invite those neighbors in and make it also our bird visitors. So where is Pickering Creek? I noticed a few of you in the chat had been to visit us, and that's great. You are more than visit us from time to time, but there's also quite a number of you who might enjoy visiting Pickering. It's definitely a community-based center. It's 410 acres with a combination of many wonderful habitats, including freshwater constructed wetlands like you see here, and meadows, and also woodlands, and the shrub meadows all across that particular area. And the trails cut through each of those habitats. We are open from dawn to dusk to the public without charge, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. To enjoy nature at your leisure. So you'd notice the trails along our wetlands and through our meadows and through woods, and you begin to notice the birds. Over 200 species of birds have been documented by our volunteers as they've worked on monitoring programs since just before 2014, but definitely more since 2014. So it's definitely been more than 7 years that we've been at this, sort of documenting what birds are using Pickering Creek throughout the season. And when you think of a wild place like Pickering Creek, you might think of waterfowl in our wetlands. So like this wood duck here, waterfowl are using our wetlands, especially in the fall, but the wood ducks, as you may know, are setting up shop. And we have a monitoring trail. So there are some families getting started. Some wood ducks have already started laying eggs, and they need a habitat, usually at the water's edge. They'll use those wetlands. They'll also use wet woodlands. They're one of the few sort of North American ducks that you might find normally perching in a tree. Most ducks don't perch at all, and naturally, they look for cavities in old trees, but providing them with a nest box can be a very successful venture. And if you're going through the wetlands in the spring or fall, or even in the winter, you may catch a sight of owls, like these barred owls here, or great horned owls, or you may even hear some things like our smaller owls that we have out as well. Or if you're cruising across through the wetland trails and looking in the skies, you might see those bald eagles. I always have a little bit to say that yes, Blackwater has a lot of eagles, but we have our share too. And we're easy to get to, and we hope you stop by and visit. There's a couple that like to actually sort of perch in the trees right along the shore of Pickering Creek and have conversations with each other. And it's quite amusing because if you know eagles or have eagles near your property, you see this giant majestic bird, and then they come out with these little chirpy sounds as their voice. So it's pretty surprising. So what I'd like to do is share a few things. Remember, birds are our neighbors, whether we have a small home or a large estate, or we're in the town or the country. And I'd like to share some neighbors that you might share in common with us. For example, this is at the end of sort of the season when Pickering Creek is doing sort of winter feeder watch, a sort of feeder watch program where we're collecting data about what birds we see at our feeders. If you are feeding birds around your home, you may notice this white-throated sparrow or others feeding at your station. They'll be moving out a little bit. You probably also hear them singing right now. These, like other songbirds, have to learn their song. They start learning it and practicing it in the fall. And then now that it's spring, they're really polishing off that song and getting ready to see if they can pair up. So it's a pleasure to hear those. And many of us enjoy the unusually loud amounts of noise that this little Carolina wrens can provide. You may see these on the edge of, say, a rail of a porch or on a low bush hanging around. Carolina wrens have some of the biggest voices based on their size. So they're sometimes the loudest thing you'll hear in your yard if you have them. And they're very vocal. They have a lot to say. So check around. You may also find that they'll make a little messy nest in the most amazing little places. So check around the eaves of your house. If you find one of their nests, they often have a little side entrance to it. I currently have one just above the doorway of my home. And that explains why I've been getting yelled at and scolded regularly by these little guys and girls as they come by. And even when you have a cut lawn, you might find things like this chipping sparrow, looking for small insects and working through that lawn. Or brown thrasher. They are found along our meadow edges in the shrub area, and they just are known for sort of their very busy behavior. They do a lot of tail wagging as well. So check out, you'll notice brown thrashers with the spotted tress, but you'll also notice those eyes, those bright yellow eyes are a good indicator for them. You might also, in a few weeks, start seeing these guys skulking around in the edges of shrubs, common yellowthroats. You might be more familiar with the little witchetty call that they make when they come in the summer. They're a really great voice of summer that you might hear. Or a kingbird, and they'll be coming in hopefully in a few weeks, along with indigo buntings. The fellows are dressed in a lovely bright blue. The ladies are dressed in a far more drab assortment, so they will look entirely different. You may also find, I just had a moment here with this bird, but you will find them out. They're related to robins, and the word will not come to me because that's how words work for me. But look around for them. And if I think of it, I'll come back to it. Now, if you're someone who has space and you really want to invite bird neighbors to your property, consider adding bird boxes. At Pickering Creek, we have bluebird nest boxes set out as well as those wood duck boxes. And here we have tons of tree swallows that love to use the bluebird nest boxes. They actually do pretty well with being neighbors to the bluebirds. And so our monitors monitor for these, as well as the lovely bluebirds and chickadees, which will also use those boxes. And of course, you may love the song of the song sparrow. They're here throughout the year, and there'll be something that you can find if you're visiting Pickering Creek in the meadows and meadow edges, and sometimes at the edge of woodlands. Many of you may know this mockingbird as a frequent yard visitor, and they are quite vocal and like many related to them. So you'll be able to pick them out. Nice, easy to identify, fairly largish compared to a little bit bigger than the sparrows that we're looking at, and good mimics. If you have a big wooded area like we do at Pickering Creek, you may have quite a few residents that will stand out. If you listen for them in a few weeks, or maybe even shorter than that, we hope to hear great crested flycatchers. You might hear bleep noises in your forest as they move about, and the leafed out trees. And warbler season is upon us. Here's a myrtle warbler. Warblers can be confusing to identify, but this one's pretty yellow and with black striping and sort of black to identify. The ladies are a little bit muted, but they tend to hang a lot lower in the landscape than many other warblers who hang out for these. And of course, in the woodlands, when you have a mixture of trees that also have the accompanying insects that will bore into them, you're going to find tons of woodpeckers like this downy woodpecker here. Excuse me, hairy woodpecker. A related one is the downy woodpecker, which is a little bit smaller and has a shorter beak. And red-bellied woodpeckers, despite the big red mohawk, there's another red-headed woodpecker whose head is completely red. That's different. But more importantly, if you have good woodlands, you might actually have an opportunity to have a site like this, and that is finding woodpecker nests and the potential nestlings with them. And of course, if you're going to be talking about woodpeckers, how about our pileated woodpeckers, which are the biggest woodpeckers we have? They'll be out there. They're always, they make a pretty big entrance whenever we see them with their broad wingspan, their heavy knocking, and also their unusual cry. But remember, there's all kinds of things that you might have been feeding at your feeder that are also enjoying your woodlands. For example, our titmice and our Carolina chickadees. If you're in the western part of the state and in the mountainous region, you might encounter other chickadees, but most of the chickadees we have in our state, the blackcaps, not so much. Almost entirely in Maryland, you're going to be looking at Carolina chickadees. Where the populations do meet, sometimes they will hybridize, but in general, what we're seeing are Carolina chickadees here. I bring this up because they're very hard to tell apart when you just look at them on the branch. Now, also, we're going to be looking for the song of a very unique bird, and this bird is going to be our ambassador for our program of Great Neighbors and makes our yard bird friendly. This is a wood thrush. This bird is noted for its unusual song that's very lilting and flute-like, and we'll expect to see them in the next few weeks, hopefully. They are much rarer than they used to be, but we still can find them. And it's because of their needs. They really are a woodland species. And as they migrate through the territories, they're looking for those resources. But they share some things in common. Just like every other migratory bird we have, they're moving on the move. They need resources as they move. And they're also going to be establishing themselves and setting up nests in the next few weeks. So having the resources to create those nesting spots and to take care of their young is a high priority. And we can do a lot to make birds successful and invite them into our yards. When they're migrating over, not so very long ago in our history, pretty much the scene that they would be looking at would involve lots and lots of woodlands. And while Maryland is known for having quite a lot of woodland cover, I think about 40% of the cover that it has had in the past, we're looking at a lot less. As we develop, not just here in Maryland, but all across the country and around the world, landscapes that were woodlands and natural areas are being transformed into spaces for human use. And often those may not necessarily take into considerations the needs of wildlife. For example, as you look into this neighborhood, the homes are gracious and magnificent, but the landscapes themselves are decorative, but sterile. Not necessarily a lot of wildlife going on there. That doesn't have to be the case. We can choose what's in our yard and choose to create spaces that are both beautiful and aesthetically pleasing for ourselves and also attractive to wildlife. I'd like to share a book that you may have heard, but a few tips, Bringing Nature Home from Doug Tallamy. It's a great resource. It can be found in libraries near you. I would suggest checking it out. But there's a few tips that are useful as you think about helping birds. at the forefront of that is using native plants, planting native plants wherever you can. Not only can they add beauty to your landscape and add value, but they provide a lot of services to birds and other wildlife. If you can use native plants wherever you can, reduce the amount of lawn or pavement that you necessarily need for to meet your needs, and plant as densely as you can actually help shade out some of the invasives, but take the time to remove as many invasive plants, that is species that are not just introduced, but disrupt natural ecosystems. So by removing those invasive plants and filling in those spaces with natives wherever we can, we make habitats much more rich for birds and useful. So how do we get started in that? How do we think about it? So here at Pickering, we're just showing a little spot where we're kind of intentional about mowing or not mowing. This is a little spot, if you've been at Pickering Creek, we often use it to gather children during school field trips. So a bit of lawn is actually really important and useful. It's a staging area, play area, it's inviting. You can see the Byron Cottage in the background, but you'll also notice that a lot of it has been allowed to grow into heavy meadow that's uncut, and just a little bit of lawn is maintained for the needs for our space here. So when you have less lawn, you're actually creating a space where the plants can soak up water and filter it before it runs off into whatever waterway it will be heading into. For us right here, the water flowing behind that little building there goes directly into a little streamlet that then attaches directly to Pickering Creek and of course wanders out eventually into the bay. And by doing less lawn and adding more native plants that are allowed to grow out to their natural height, we actually provide enhanced benefits for wildlife. So how can we do this? One idea is to use native plants, plant in layers. When you create dense plantings, you actually create vertical space. In our little native shade garden, we have very low-lying plants that are dainty and pretty at the outskirts of that and draw in pollinators. We also have some shrubs and taller herbaceous material that fills in that middle layer. So it creates a rich, dense landscape where birds and pollinators visiting that space can actually move around in layers. It also creates a nice visual. So what does that look like in terms of helping birds? In this beautiful illustration through Yard Map, you'll notice that we have the ground layer and understory, and there'll be some birds that are associated with that. Things like that Carolina wren that'll be using resources at the lower understory. And then if you have tall shrubs or very small trees in that mid-story, different birds will then use that space and then on up into the canopy where there are birds very high up, taking advantages of resources and possibly nesting pretty much out of sight as the trees leaf in for the summer. So how can that apply to a space like this? As you look at this home, it's a gracious home. There's a huge lawn and there are a few trees. But if you were to evaluate it for habitat and say, well, how can this lawn help birds and what's missing? You might notice something. There's this great swath of lawn. It's just been cut, probably about an inch or two. And there's not a lot else. There's not really that middle layer. And oftentimes that middle layer that sort of creates the vertical structure is lost in many yards. So how can we think about adding that back in and taking care of the needs of birds? Let's go back and think a little bit about what do birds need? They need some of the same things that we do. They need food. Native plants are going to provide that. They need water and shelter. Again, plants can really fill in that need for shelter. both for nesting sites and places to be protected from weather or predators. And of course, when you provide all those resources, you're creating really important habitat. So when we think of food and birds, it's very easy to think of things like a robin pulling a worm out of the earth, or maybe a bird going by with a berry. But really, all of those are pretty important food sources. They can use berries or sip nectar or use nuts and seeds. But if you'll notice that insects are sort of at the core of this pyramid, birds can use all of those resources, and sometimes they'll use different resources at different times of the year. For example, you might have been feeding birds at a feeder in your yard this winter, and they were using the seeds that you provided. Those same birds will not necessarily be feeding seeds to their babies in the summer. But let's get started. Let's start with things that will provide those insects. Why the focus on insects? Here's an example. You'll notice if you look at native species of oak, or all the oaks, they support over 500 species of caterpillars. And caterpillars are the fuel that raises up baby birds. However, if you compare that with ginkgos, which are an introduced species, they only support 4 species of caterpillars. Now, if you're a bird and you're looking to feed your young ones, and you're looking into a landscape that's planted with native oak trees, for example, versus one that is planted with an ornamental tree that's introduced, they're going to be looking for the trees that provide the most food. So why do oak trees have so many more caterpillars associated with it? That's because plants and the insects that depend on them have relationships that have been established over millennia. So plants develop defensive chemicals, energy. Perhaps you already know of the relationship that you see in this picture. It's milkweed and of course monarch caterpillars. Monarchs are milkweed specialists. Their eggs are laid on these plants, and the caterpillars can deal with the noxious chemicals that milkweeds produce. And so this is a species that requires milkweeds as its host plant. Now think about all insects oftentimes having all the insects that we're thinking about that birds are needing, having similar relationships with native plants. When we use native plants, the insects associated with it are often present. And when they're present, they feed the birds. Because frankly, a world without insects is a world without songbirds. I will say specifically songbirds because 96% of North American birds, other than seabirds, feed their young on insects. And they contain a lot of protein. They also have a lot of fat, which is great for little growing birds, and they're more digestible than many insects once they reach the adult phase. Okay, so let's go back to that chickadee. Chickadees, they're tiny little birds. They're really feeding their babies, primarily the soft-bodied insects, mostly caterpillars. So how many caterpillars do they need to raise up their babies? If you look in here at these chickadee babies, if you look at your pinky, the little eggs are like the tip of your pinky. They're really small. And of course, their babies are born blind and helpless. And it takes chickadee parents about 16 days from the time their babies hatch until the time they're ready to fledge out of the nest. And they're feeding them constantly every day. And researchers have found that chickadee parents are bringing hundreds upon hundreds of insects to feed their nestlings each day. And what this adds up to is about 900, give or take, insects or especially caterpillars that are fed to raise that one clutch of chickadees. Think about that, 9,000 insects to get the babies in the nest and up out to a fledgling stage. So if that's the case, what can we put in our yards that provides us shade and the values of trees? Well, here's a lovely list of best caterpillar trees. So we're looking at groups of native plants. So oaks, followed by willows and cherries. And of course, we know there are ornamental cherries that are non-native. We're speaking here in this case of our native cherries. And at Pickering, we have quite a few of pretty much most of those plants are actually represented at Pickering Creek. So here's another example. I'll give you a chance to sort of guess here. This interesting caterpillar, who do you think it might belong to? Well, if you guessed Viceroy butterfly, you'd be correct. And they really, really depend on willows as their host. Let's go back to our wood thrush. As wood thrush are moving through our area, what can we give them that can help as they migrate, both northward in the spring and south in the winter? Well, if it's migrating along, a really great fruit to have in the fall is spicebush. Right now, the spicebush have long finished blooming this spring, but in the fall, they'll put out these nice berries that are really high in fat, and they're really useful for wildlife. They also happen to be a host plant for spicebush swallowtail butterflies. Another small tree that is both delightful as an ornamental in the yard and also useful for birds is the dogwood. So their berries, also again, high in fat, really good energy sources for migrating birds. Let's look at some other fruits. Blueberries are high in energy and sugars. They're coming out in the summer, but think about those parent birds. They're delivering the caterpillars to the nest. It's really great to have some insects for the parents to depend, not just insects, but also some fruit for quick energy. Cherries are also a great source. Fall fruits that last and that are waxy and fatty and useful, oftentimes. Now let's switch over to nectar. When we think of nectar, perhaps hummingbirds come to mind. And one of the things is blooming right now and is just getting started are wild columbine. Columbine's a lovely flower to add to the garden if you're new to exploring native plants and want something beautiful and dainty that will fit into a small garden bed, but also help you to attract things like hummingbirds. They do indeed visit the columbine at Pickering Creek, as well as the coral honeysuckle, and often all through the summer. When the columbine is done, the coral honeysuckle will still be blooming throughout the season. Another great flowering plant, jewelweed, attracts hummingbirds. And it's not just the red that we often think that hummingbirds are attracted to. They will show up for this yellow jewelweed or even the orange varieties here. Let's switch to seeds. So you can see the jay is taking advantage of oak resources directly, not just from the seed, the insects, but also the seeds they provide. These birds are a powerhouse of helping to spread seeds around for oaks, burrowing them hundreds of seeds and being able to find them throughout the winter. But they do miss a few, and quite a few oaks have been probably planted by jays. Another great source of seeds, especially for smaller birds, pine seeds provide great ones. When you think about seeds, sometimes we think about shrubs and trees, but don't forget our grasses and herbaceous plants and meadows. So for example, goldenrods that you see in the fall, the resulting seeds are very useful for small birds, as well as things like little blue stem, those grass seeds are very useful as a food source. Now we're switching a little bit from plants for a moment to remember those other parts of things that birds need. Water. So we've talked about food resources, but birds do need access for water. It's very easy to provide that if you have a still water source, something as simple as a shallow dish that can be poured out and cleaned regularly, or if you're able to provide a way for water to trickle. That is very attractive to birds and will also provide a useful water source for bathing and drinking. Back to the plants, when we're thinking about shelter and nesting sites, if you have evergreen hedges using native plants include many evergreen options. You might be providing places for birds to set up a nesting area in your yard, as well as a place to hide or to escape danger. As you think about your space and the things you have in your space in your yard, there are a few other things you can do to help birds. In the winter, when many of the trees are bare, and if you have a little wooded lot, instead of raking everything perfectly clean, creating a brush pile can provide a little bit of shelter that's really useful for birds. For example, the white-throated sparrow, they will readily use those brush piles as a sheltering space. So consider that as a useful thing if you have a place where that can be tucked in, as opposed to having all of your brush removed. Another thing, if you can leave the leaf litter, you actually provide places for insects that are overwintering. So we think about insects in their larval forms or adult forms that might burrow in the ground under the leaves or burrow in the leaves. You're actually providing a source of food for that migrating wood thrush in the spring as those things emerge out. And you will see them working the leaf litter, looking for insects. If you can, and you're in a safe space, even a tree that has long died provides a really valuable service. So leaving nesting snag sites is a potential for a nesting area in terms of tree cavities or perching areas, and is very well used. For example, those eagles I mentioned to you earlier, and also the osprey on our creek, there are a few trees that are in safe places that have died and that hang as snags, and they tend to prefer those in the landscape. Now, how do you get started on a big adventure if you're thinking about ways to make your yard more bird friendly? Well, dream as big as you want, but start small. I'm going to take you back to Pickering Creek and show you a little project that we worked on that is ongoing and still continuing. If you've had a chance to come to Pickering Creek, one of those is what we refer to as sort of our settlers garden area, and we changed it to create a more bird-friendly garden space. So if you look, it has a little teeny demonstration cabin there. The walkway is at the bottom. You'll see a little rectangles that represents a garden bed that's right along the gravel driveway. The little area in the middle that you see between the two black dots on either side represents a pergola, and the black dots trees that are shading that area. And then the garden bed's laid out. We actually had volunteers work with us to think about the space and help us to think about how to redecorate it in such a way that we could reclaim it again. It had been a children's garden. It had been used for different things over the years, and we wanted to reshape it in a way that would make it more bird friendly. And this is the design they came up with. So we took this lovely design, which is really nice. They thought a lot about the plants to go in there, about the reducing pathways, and we picked a project. So you notice the project that we focused on was Pollinator Island, with a little arrow from the left heading towards the right. So we focused on that. We had some of our high school students in Caroline County help us to plan it in, and also volunteers to help us to prepare that space. So here you see the students at work They actually, in spring of 2019, it helped us install the plants, and they were finishing up with the planting of plugs and mulching. This is what our little center bed looked like to get started. All planted in. It looks really wonderful. This is in April, and end of project, right? No, that's the beginning of this project. Hence, start small so that you can think about how that space will work. Over the summer, the first summer, things stayed pretty small. And I spent a lot of time, and volunteers spent a lot of time watering and checking and weeding just to help those plants grow. Oftentimes new plants, you give them a first year to sort of just think about it, put those roots down, and then the next year they'll start to come up. For example, this past summer, in its second year, the garden finally attained its full sort of height. The plants had come in, those that had survived, and things began to look more mature. And of course, there was the weeding, the seeing which plants really turned out to be in a good space and which ones need to be replaced. However, we now have a spot that connects a wooded area across the roadway from it to another wood area to the side, where we see goldfinches come in and use those giant Rebecca Maxima that you see, the really tall plants either side of that garden. They come in and use the seeds from that. We've seen lots of pollinating insects, things like clearing hummingbird moths, and of course the bees and butterflies using this space, and the birds using the trees at the edge of the garden right here at the front, around the pergola, and connecting to the trees from the side and dipping into the garden space. So it's doing exactly what we hope, becoming an inviting space that birds are using. Some of the real gems that we enjoyed in the past year that did well were penstemon plants that really were very attractive to bees and other pollinators. And the blue-eyed grass that you see in the corner there, that just made it a really great edging and a great contrast. But remember, this is where we started this first year. It can happen. You just have to take your time and dream big, but start small at about whatever size you're willing to tackle for yourself, even if that's thinking about a container plant for yourself. So how do you get started? Maybe you're thinking about, how can I even find plants? I know a few native plants, but not a lot. I don't know a lot about which ones might be useful for birds. I'd like to invite you to check out National Audubon Society's Plants for Birds website. If you Google that, you can find it that you can actually put in your zip code. If you'd like to receive information from Audubon, you can add your email address. However, if you don't, you can simply put in your zip code and search. And you can search for plants that are native to your area by zip code. Now that you have a list of potential plants, you can actually search by types. And then you'll notice you'll be able to find shrubs, trees, things that provide fruit or are attractive to butterflies. And you'll notice that it will tell you some of the species that it might support. For example, the dogwood here, supporting things like waxwings and crows. Remember that middle layer that tends to be missing when we said, think about creating layers in the landscape? Well, you can actually even look for shrubs and things that might fit into that middle layer. Say you're looking for local resources. You can find us here and probably find other opportunities when we will be talking about plants or birds, just as we're doing today. And we're also willing to work with you if there is a question about that and direct you to resources we know about. And what if you're looking for places that actually sell native plants? If you're using the zip code like we did for our area right here, you can see some local plant nurseries that offer native plants near us in our region. Of course, when you're using native plants, they are really tough and they are really fit into the landscape well and have relationships with the animals that live here in a way that benefits them, but they still need to be in the right place. Native plants, like all plants, grow best in their most optimal growing conditions. So for example, if you're filling in a sunny meadow that happens to be upland, you need to think about what plants are going to work well in a sunny place, in a well-drained soils, in a meadow setting. For example, the goldenrod pictured in and the milkweed in this particular meadow. Another really great guide that you can, it's kind of hard to find in print, there are still copies. It's this Wildlife Habitat and Land Conservation Landscaping Guide. Links to it online and look at that. And it's many people who are looking at native plants and trying for the first time would recommend this. It's a great resource. I'd advise you to check it out. We'll be sharing those links with you later on at the end. So there's some really awesome benefits we're enjoying and helping birds to feel welcome in our yards. Some benefits that come directly to us. How many of us don't enjoy hearing, first of all, bird song in our yard? Or maybe you're a person who also enjoys a little bit of gardening. So adding native plants and helping birds and making your bird more yard friendly, has personal benefits. Over time, once native plants are established beyond those initial stages where your area, you tend to have you spend a lot less time and money babying them along because they're in the correct conditions for their growth. Things like adding native trees can increase your property value. When you're planting densely and using natives, you're reducing pollution because native plants, like all plants, can help take up extra nitrogen and help filter our waterways, filter water going into our waterways. As we increase the density of plantings in our yards, you can reduce invasives because nature abhors a vacuum. So filling in those bare spots with natives can reduce the amount of trouble you have with invasives later. They will always pop up, but native plants can help you with that. And it gives us a sense of place. When you use plants that are representative of an area, it sort of fits into our vision of a landscape and restores ecosystem services. Things we talked about, like cleaner water, also food and resources for wildlife. So again, start small and enjoy your yard and invite birds to your yard. These gardeners did it. This is a gardener that Pickering Creek Audubon Center had the opportunity to work with through Habitat for Humanity Chop Tank. We work with several new homeowners to establish native plant habitat areas in their yard. And this is one just after it was just planted. Nora here took her whole front yard, just small, and she was able to just rip out all her crabgrass and entirely include natives in her front yard. She loves it. I just literally talked with her this weekend. She's a volunteer coordinator with Habitat for Humanity Chop Tank and also was one of the gardeners. And she's been so excited by her success. She's ready to share that with new homeowners. So you can create a bird-friendly backyard, and I would love to hear about your success. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Agnes.
So thank you, Sam. We really appreciate this. It was very informative, great pictures, great. I loved how you talked about the vertical height. So in forestry, we talk about that as a soft edge. So we're going from a hard forest, if we're thinking about it being a forest, then we're providing this soft edge to provide most of those habitat requirements. So that's great. So we have a few questions, and I put in several links in the chat, y'all, if you want to have a look. But again, Sam has provided us with the list of resources that she was mentioning in her talk, and we're going to email those out to y'all. All right, so this first question is, so this person heard that ordinary housebirds are invasive species and are a cause of songbird decline. I reported feral cats living in one of the City of Gaithersburg's forest retention areas to animal control. I was told cats aren't a problem, and that there is an organization that actually supports feral cats once they've been trapped, neutered, and released. Do you have any thoughts on the matter?
So we're speaking about cats and their impacts on birds, correct?
Yes, that's
So I utterly love cats personally. And many of us have cats and as well as dogs as pets. But we as humans, this is one of the ways that we alter landscapes, both through our actions and directly on the landscape and indirectly by how we interact with other species. And cats as pets, they're predators. Even a well-fed kitty will hunt, and birds are on the menu. Millions of birds are caught by cats every year in this country, millions. And go to YouTube and do tracking cat videos, and you will be astonished and amazed. That doesn't mean you can't have a cat or that cats are inherently evil. That's simply not a thing. But cats have an impact as predators on birds. If you want to attract birds to your yard and you want to have feeders, your cat or your neighbor's cat can be a real detriment to their success. Anybody who's ever had baby birds starting out knows how vulnerable they are to predators, especially when they're about to fledge. And when you've had little baby birds hopping around who are still practicing flying, and you have a cat whose ears are going to immediately perk up, it's a mix that's not going to end well for the birds. So keeping your kitties indoors actually in the long run is healthier for them because they then are exposed to a lot fewer sort of potential health issues, and it separates them from birds and allows them to be successful in natural spaces. Our cats, we're taking care of them. They're getting fed, they have a place to be sheltered, but our wild birds have to make use of the resources that they have on their own. So if we can give our wild birds a chance and also keep our cats happy. A lot of people have been very creative. For example, they create catios so that their cat can have outdoor time, or they have trained, and I don't know, more power to them, train their kitties to walk on a leash so that they can get that sort of natural instinctive urge to be outside covered and keep their cat happy. So consider what are those things, what you can live with. Work with your neighbors if there's a feral cat issue. Feral cats can cause a lot of damage because then they're out usually breeding in and not being sort of maintained by an individual or homeowner. And that can cause a lot of problems, even if your kitty is indoors and being watched over. And their lives, frankly, are not as healthy and as successful as a cat that's well maintained.
great. Thank you. All right, we have a question here now going to the maintenance of native and perennials. So native perennials and native grasses. Okay, can you comment on how we should adjust our maintenance of native perennials and native grasses to make them available longer as food and shelter sources during winter? Example, not cutting back on native grasses until the end of winter. Any other tips?
I love the tip that was already suggested. And so thank you for both asking and thinking through and sharing out. At the end of the garden, sometimes it is a great rush in order to keep things nice and tidy in the yard, to be a little clean. Everything must be brushed and swept. But if you allow yourself to be an untidy gardener and give yourself a pat on the back and go ahead and use your porch more and do less work, you actually help wildlife. For example, by not deadheading all those plants that have seed heads, you're providing a food resource that they may not need early in the fall when there's a lot of stuff going on and there's still some insects. But as the winter progresses and food resources become scarce, those seed heads will start getting used. So delaying cutting back things like the seed heads on plants that might provide resources until spring, about this time of the year. So when you're cleaning up in March and April and trying to tidy up so you can see the new growth, cutting stuff back then, if you're in an area where you can do that, that is a really great way to help wildlife. Another thing that I mentioned in the program that is also useful, if you're in an area and you you have a yard that has many trees and lots of leaves, do you have a space to allow the leaf litter to lay? If it's a part of your yard that not a lot of people really are tramping around in, and you don't need it as long, you actually create habitat spaces for things that will overwinter. We talked about how the wood thrush and also other birds will flip through the leaf litter looking for things that are overwintering and coming up. So allowing that to lay, even if you can't just let it lay and you want to strip your yard away or have it cleaned, look very clean, consider mowing in your leaves as opposed to just taking all those nutrients away. If you have a yard where it's so many trees that it's not really grassy anyway, having that layer of duff, you basically given the trees and other things there what it needs back in terms of nutrients by letting it lay there. If you're allowing the leaves to lay there, they will actually mulch down and slow down growth under. So some benefits of just letting it be is actually just creating spaces where pollinators and other kinds of insects that provide food for birds can be.
Yeah. Yeah, that topic of leaf litter and insects came up. We did a insect presentation a few months ago, and that question of leaf litter came up. And the recommendation there is if you want to move your leaf litter off your property, to maybe just put it somewhere else on your property rather than bagging it and getting rid of it or mulching it up because the insects are still in there. So that's, it is pretty interesting when we think about how these insects camouflage. They're wanting to keep themselves safe, so they have adapted to be able to hide in that leaf litter. So we may look at this pile and say, oh, there's no bugs in that, but yeah, interesting points.
Yeah, I'd like to add maybe another point to not deadheading. Thinking about where you want to mow and how much mowing really needs to happen. For example, one of the goals we had is if we don't need to mow, and can we reduce how much we're doing? Just think about the emissions of your mower. It's a lot of gas. That's probably more gas goes and mowers, and it's a less efficient system. Just mowing less. If there's an area you can allow to be meadows and you're not having an invasive weed problem, that you can allow just to grow out to its natural extent, can create wildlife value. So native grasses that are instead of cut down to to yard length, lawn length, just by allowing it to grow taller increases the value of that sort of ground layer as habitat. So you can actually sort of extend sort of cues of care, like I do care about my yard, by creating zones of mowed areas and non-mowed areas. So as people visit, they understand that it's intentional and it's not just a yard gone wild, but it's a yard that's inviting to wild and inviting to people at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you do want to mow, understanding the phenology or the life, the natural history of the birds that could be creating their habitat in those tall grasses you've grown. And that's where, monitoring and enjoying your meadow area that you've created becomes important, so that you understand, oh, shoot, I know that bird nested in this area at this time of year last year, so I'm going to hold off on my mowing. So yeah, that's a great tip. Yeah, understanding that. Another question came in on the topic. Is there an organization that might help lobby to reduce the noise and air pollution problems of mowers and blowers? Do you happen to know?
I don't know. That's a really great question, but I honestly don't know. But that is definitely something that I would research. Audubon is definitely an organization that thinks about things that are risky to birds, like thinking about lights out and reducing lights out and working with cities and municipalities to reduce that as a threat, or with reflective surfaces and giving people ideas to reduce like bird and window strikes. But an organization that focuses directly on sort of like lawn and tools, I'm not sure about that one. But it definitely is worth a bit of research.
You brought up a really good point, Sam, that the birds flying into your window. So, I'm working at home these days and my desk is in a beautiful spot. But I was thinking a week ago, oh, 'tis the season. The birds are going to be running into my window. Do you have any tips on what I can do so that I have less birds? What window strike? You called it something, but that they won't hit my window.
So yeah, window strikes is preventing and reducing window strikes is what you're aiming for. If you have a feeder in your yard, some recommendations for that is to keep the feeder very close to the viewing window, or very within about 3 meters or over 30, which seems a little odd. But if they're coming into the feeder, they're slowing down. Sometimes if you have blinds or things or something to break up the reflection, because when you look at a door, think about a glass door. How many of us have gone through a glass door or headed towards a glass door and didn't see the reflection and whacked yourself?
Oh, yeah.
If you're a bird and you're looking into a window and you see the reflection of a tree that you want to get to, there is nothing up there that necessarily computes that that's glass. And so anything that you can do to break up that reflection could be something as simple as little window decals. That's a great fun activity to do with kids, to create window decals. And there's tons of ways to do that. You can buy reflective decals or reflective laminates that you can add to your glass that you can still see through, but then that just break up that reflection that birds see, and that reduces strikes. Of course, if a hawk is coming through your backyard, a lot of time, even birds that kind of know, in quotes, that window is there, all bets are off if they're trying to get away. And you'll sometimes hear that. Like it's scary when you hear a bird like really whack your window. You're like, so reducing that reflection, try not to have the food resources be there so they're coming in at a great rate of speed close by, like making it close to the window so they're slowing down, or really far away in a place where you can view. Those are helpful. Putting up things that break up the reflection, decals. I had a homeowner and neighbor who did something really unusual. She didn't use decals, and it was just to make a cardinal stop banging his head against the glass as a reflection. She actually cut threads and created this sort of lattice of string hung from the top to the lower part of a really wide window just to break that up. And it reduced her cardinal having negative interactions because it spent so much time worrying about the other cardinal and being aggressive as opposed to worrying about its own nest site, because it looked like another weird, not quite a window strike, but then an interaction with a reflective surface that's not healthy. That actually worked for her. So try different things, but that'll get you started for sure.
Thanks. We're getting lots of platitudes. People are saying, thank you. You're inspiring people to get out. You're reminding people of their already good habits of staying indoors and not raking. So you're reminding them of the work that they're already doing is in line with bird-friendly yards. So that's appreciated. We got a lot of appreciation. So a question came up here. I have another question too, but we'll go to this question here. Light pollution. Do we turn off our lights at night? Are we encouraged? Because the moths come. What is the activity like at night, and how does the light pollution influence the birds at night and
So light pollution is astounding. I'll give you an example of something that most of us are familiar with. So if you think about the 9/11 memorial, the 9/11 memorial in New York are these beams that are upward facing. And Audubon and other organizations have worked to sort of, with the Memorial Association to create a plan, because when birds are migrating, it can be very disorienting. That's huge. So you see flocks of especially young birds migrating, circling and circling and circling, and that can be distracting and exhausting. If you're a migrating bird, you're already using your resources and stretching it to the very limit of where it can go. For example, we hear about marathon migrations where birds are flying thousands of miles, even our local migrants as they hop from resource to resource. to use that up, swirling around in lights and exhausting themselves, you have a point where sometimes birds drop out of the sky from exhaustion. That's not healthy. That makes them easy predator food. They might even actually die if they're already stressed at some point. So one of the tricks for that particular thing was working with the memorial group to just sort of do lights out during peak migration times or when they notice a certain volume of birds circling. A thing that we can do that's more practical, say like in our yards or things, is instead of having sort of accent lights that feature our homes, if we can don't need those and it's not a safety concern, just not having those and using motion detection lights that come on just when you need them, that actually reduces some impacts. And it's not just birds. By just taking and taking care of the birds, you're thinking about things like moths and other insects are using those. Lights in general or night lights in general are very stressing for a lot of different wildlife. That includes birds, includes things like sea turtles, etc. So fewer lights, using lights when we need it. I think in some cases if you need a low light, having sort of a yellow, or you can usually buy those like lights that tend to draw fewer insects.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know there was such a thing.
So I think it's pretty common. I will have to look it up. I would encourage anyone to sort of look it up if there are lighting options with sort of colors that are less attractive as opposed to the typical more white lights that we like to light up things.
Nice. So I was thinking about what you said, that oak tree has over 500 species of insects that it hosts, and the ginkgo had 5 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So let's say that, I want my yard to have these trees in it, but my trees are super small right now. But I want to provide the food for the babies. You said the 96% of North American birds, other than seabirds, feed their young with insects. That hit really home with me. So if my trees are not yet housing a lot of insects, how else can I help out the birds so that they're able to feed their young? Like this is an interesting question for me. I asked this of another person too.
I guess a couple of parts.
Okay.
If you want to add a tree, today is a great time to add a tree. Don't wait on it and say, this tree is going to take 15 or 20, years to get to a size that's going to be a big deal. I remember at Pickering, we had Doug Tallamy visit and do a presentation for us. And one of the things he noted, so he's a professor who focuses on insects and in the landscape and has talked about, of course, the connection between insects and birds, along with many other voices. And one of the things in his own property that he mentioned that I thought was really awesome was that, I planted these small trees. They're not very big yet, but I photograph insects. And he showed us a plethora of insects that even though the tree was small, that those species that he had on his property was already attracting to his yard based on the native plants. So even if that tree is going to be small and not necessarily provide value as a sheltering space early on, it's still providing a resource, maybe in food, and its value will continue to grow along with it over the years. So I would say don't let having a very small tree deter you. On the other hand, if you can afford to buy a larger tree, and that is something you're willing to invest in and you have space for, you can always invest in a larger tree that then is a little bit bigger than what deer will gnaw at and get it started with something that's a burlapped wrap tree or something like that with a big base. However, if economics and just space and thinking about that and you want to start with something smaller, that's okay. That tree, if you take care of it, is going to grow and still fill in that space.
Great. Somebody commented here, Doug Tallamy showed a caterpillar eating a 1-inch tall, is that a 1 foot tall tree? So they do feed on that. My other question, in amongst all these platitudes and stuff, I had a question. You showed a picture of a butterfly that looked like a monarch, but it was not. It favored the willow tree. Can you repeat the name of that butterfly?
It's a viceroy.
Okay, right. But yeah, okay, great. Good, good, good. All right, y'all, I see that it's 1:11. And if you have any more questions, now's the time to put it in the chat. We really appreciate that Sam was here, really encouraging us to plant these native plants. That Columbine is popping right now. And she encouraged us and let us know that the things that we're already doing are good. Somebody had mentioned a little tip. When they deadhead their plants, they actually put the deadheads to the side. They don't throw them in the garbage, but they keep the seeds somewhere else. So that's an interesting tip. So we appreciate Samantha for being here, and we appreciate the Audubon for the work that they do. Before I let everybody go here, I want to let everybody know, hey, next month, do you guys know what's happening in nature coming up here? You've heard of it. I'm not telling you anything new. The cicadas are emerging, right? You guys know this. 3 different types are emerging. Next month is going to be the cicada talk. So if y'all want to join in next month, again, you'll get the link for that when we send out the email. That link is also going to include Samantha's presentation. It's going to include some of the resources. That planting guide. Hey, I did have another question. You showed that map that y'all did for your garden there. Was that a program that you used, or was that just drawn by somebody that's super skilled? Or
No, that was drawn by a volunteer who is super skilled and laid it out for us. And they just really poured their hearts in when when I explained the idea and said, hey, as a volunteer, we want to create a space that our students can participate in. And so we met and worked around that, and it was a couple of them worked on pieces of it. And another person or two also contributed some ideas and developed that overall plan. So yeah, not a program that I know of. A lot of it was hand-drawn using sort of like graph paper to guide them and rulers.
Oh, great, great. Okay, you guys, any last questions to come in? Sam, any last thoughts before we wrap up here?